This podcast is a project of the Medina Focus, with the goal of providing space for collaboration and community among practitioners to the Muslim diaspora in North America. As people around the world have immigrated to the West, many Christians have realized that they live and work in the midst of the nations, and they often feel alone and unprepared to communicate cross-culturally. If you're looking for conversation and community surrounding issues of loving Muslim friends in Jesus' name, we welcome you into the conversation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the final show of 2020. My name is Brian. Today I'm going to be joined by the wife of our guest last week, and they're a super interesting couple. I had to record this part apart from the interview just so I can ask the question humorously. I'm sure they would not appreciate it, but are they a missions power couple? Are those such a thing in the missions world? Obviously, I would answer that question yes. We really appreciated having Trevor on last week, and my conversation today with Samantha is going to be really interesting. She is part of a growing group of people that are engaging in trauma care as a way of engaging really on both sides of the aisle, because every trauma care person I talk with notes not only that this is such an important tool for working with refugees who are coming from war-torn areas or have experienced lots of trauma, but it's also very useful for people who are working in the missions community, as many of our people are wounded on teams or just through the work itself, and so very valuable on both sides of the aisle. Most of our questions today are going to focus on the topic of trauma care and her direct ministry there, but I want to invite you to check out our other podcast, which is Nations Reaching Nations. In a week or two, I will have her on that program, and we're going to be talking about an issue that's not exactly connected to Muslim ministry, but I know it's on a lot of our minds, and that is the questions of diversifying our team from a multi-ethnic or multicultural perspective. This is something we hear at a lot of conferences where people are talking about how do we get more speakers or more participants or more teammates or people at the organizational level from different backgrounds. How do we become more friendly to that? And so we're going to have a conversation about that. Samantha is a Southern California native who has lived with her husband on 3 continents and is surprised to be back again in her home area of California. This time with her husband, 3 kids, and multiple pets. She was trained to be a multilingual education specialist, but has transitioned in recent years to studying about trauma, recovery, and cultural intelligence to inform ministry workers on how to care for others better. She's now part of her organization's diaspora team and is also on the anthropology team. Being a part of the Chinese diaspora as a child of immigrant parents makes work among the diaspora populations feel personable and relatable for her. Samantha, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. We've seen you through some of our other meetings and just had some really great dialogue with you. So I'm excited to hear a little bit more about your life. So could you tell us a little bit about what you're currently doing?
Yeah, so on the teams that I'm working on, I would say, as our organization has started to want to take into account diaspora populations and thinking about, whatever work that people might be doing, whatever their people group focus is, where else in the world might people be relocated to or dispersed to, whether forcibly or by choice, which when it comes down to it, a lot of times it's forcibly, underlying all of that. And in that, we recognize that ends up being a lot of displaced people that we're looking at. And that with that comes a lot of trauma. And so I've kind of dedicated the last few years to researching about trauma and recovery and resilience and how to care for that. But since so much of mental health care and, research is from a Western perspective, I've been looking particularly at like collectivist and non-Western ways of resilience and and trying to think, how can we recognize what ways people from different backgrounds have like a wholeness in life, right? Like how they might perceive trauma and feel it in ways that might be different from those that have been studied so much in Western perspectives, and then how they can recover and how they might already be doing things to recover, and then how can we then encourage and support that, and also be interacting in ways that feel healing, right? And so in that, I've learned about a lot of different trauma specific interventions that people have tried to make that are more communal and community based. But then I've been looking a lot at the idea of trauma informed ministry, or how we can relate to people in whatever kind of ministry we're at, so that the average practitioner or ministry worker, as they're just being friends with someone who might be displaced, or can be like a good friend and be a healing presence in whatever kind of ministry they're in, or even put into place trauma informed ways of doing ministry that would be healing. So that's one realm. And then on the other side, on the anthropology side, thinking about how, when we talk about diaspora, I like to not think of it as just being, how do we reach to diaspora communities, but how do we also include and have diaspora people working alongside, right? Like being the workers themselves. And in that comes like the idea of multicultural teams, and how can we best work together in multicultural contexts to do that well. And so I feel like I've been apprenticing under a Korean American colleague who is much more knowledgeable in all of this, and she's been teaching me and training me and having me come alongside and learn from her as she gives all of her trainings on cultural awareness and team building and conflict resolution cross-culturally and things like that.
So as I'm listening to you talk, I'm hearing you talk about certain things that themselves are relatively new categories, things like trauma care. And then you're adding this this kind of second level to it, the second layer of strata, which is, and I'm thinking about these from non-Western ways, and I'm really excited about this. One, because we're just dealing, people who are working with diaspora people are not working with people from a Western paradigm, and so much of Western medicine, Western thought is just that, it's Western. But I imagine that you are, you're trying some experiments in this, right? There's ways that you are pushing some boundaries, and so what are the risks that you're taking as you're kind of studying into these new avenues?
I think when you ask about risks, my initial response is that I'm not taking any risks, because we obviously want to be trauma informed and do our best at things. But I think the more I've learned about things, and the more that I'm starting to think about, say, what you're saying, the cultural aspect of it, I feel as though the risk that I'm taking is in being countercultural in what I'm inviting people to think about, or how I'm inviting them to work, right? Is to take into account that they, which predominantly right now are Western workers, who might come from a Western mindset or been trained in Western thought, just throughout their entire lives, they've been enculturated that way, to then move them towards thinking more people focused, less time oriented, to take into account all these things and work in very countercultural ways, which in general, when we think of cross-cultural workers, that's so much of what we try to get people to do. But then to put that into practice, and especially when we talk about healing for trauma, as I've studied different things there's so much about preventative care, I feel like, that is necessary, is in saying, when you want to care for someone who's been traumatized, it's really important that you work through your own trauma, or that you learn to recognize that in yourself and see how that affects ways of being for yourself that get in the way of being able to be a good listener to someone else, to being someone who doesn't then get triggered by a traumatic traumatic reaction from someone else.
Right.
Trying
to help them.
Right. That you can. So in all of that, I feel like the risky thing is to say, hey, like, you need to take care of yourself, or like learn about yourself, and that you need to take time to process this, or get into rhythms where you're processing your own trauma regularly, so that you are the best tool or the best friend that you can be to traumatized people. And in all of that, the preventative care is not very results oriented. Like, you know what I mean? It's
right.
so much easier to be like, oh, I'm treating something after it's been done, but to like back it up and do preventative care, that's not very flashy. It's like, okay, what are you doing? Like, you're doing this thing. So I think that in this, I run risks of losing people, or, like in a fast paced environment where people are like, we want to see results, and we want to see, how many people that you're saving from these dire straits, that what I'm doing is very purposeful, and I'm trying to put into practice the things that I've learned, and to be very values driven, but that can be not seen as very meaningful or helpful, when I'm thinking that it will be, like, the payoff long term will be really good.
I think probably some of what you've hit on is something that all of our guests feel in a certain way when I ask this question about experimentation and risks. And maybe nobody says it quite so clearly, but I think there is an element of, I'm doing things differently. Will I just be rejected for it at some point? Will people receive sort of the innovation that I'm providing, that I see the benefit? I mean, it's
right.
There's a trial and error element of this, of is doing things from this different paradigm, this different way, actually going to be beneficial, and will that benefit be understood and received, or is it just going to be meh, no thanks?
Yeah, or will things be cut off before the payoff comes?
Oh yeah, that's a huge one. Yes,
because if people are looking for results real fast, and the results that you're working on won't be coming for a while, then will you have the support needed to get to the point where it actually pays off?
Right. And I know I'm probably voicing many people's thoughts as they're thinking about their own daily life and thinking of this. There's so many projects I get into where I think, okay, at what point am I doubling down on an error? Or is this the moment where I persevere and then I see it come to fruition? And it's one of those things where I don't think you know until you know. So I think we get into these project studies, different things that we try doing, with the understanding that our objective and our goal is somewhere over here. And then at some point we see this beautiful thing that God is doing over there. There's kind of an unintended outcome. So what are the unintended outcomes from your work there?
Yeah. I thought when I started studying about trauma that I was learning how we could be more sensitive to care for others, and that it was like, I'm going to learn how to be a trauma-informed person, so when I'm with traumatized people, I can do better. And what I did not realize until I got into it was how much it begins with ourselves, right? Like that we need to find healing from God first, that we need to find.
For that?
And I mean, in a certain way, you do you realize, oh yeah, like I can't necessarily be trauma informed unless I've done some work, But I think even before that, it was like realizing that, or learning that community care is so important, right? That if we're wanting to be a part of the resilience, or supporting and encouraging the resilience of others, we need to build into the community resilience of our own community, right? And to care for that as well, right? I don't know. It kind of goes back to basics, right? Where you're like, oh, you need to, in ministry, you need to care for your own family and your own, mental, spiritual, emotional health first before you can be a good, messenger to others or, bringing that. But I think that's been a big thing is the move and focus towards community care and having that be something where I'm like, we need to be living that, modeling that, like wanting to do that among each other, or else how can we support that or see that in other people, and how much community has come into it too, is like in saying, how can we look through different eyes to see that resilience might come in forms that are much more simple, that when we interact with refugee friends who are doing everything they can to support their kids and to help their kids get good educations, that is a form of resilience. That is a form of healing from trauma. And so that in us supporting that, that we are supporting them, and or that, like, if they're in an ESL class and they're supposedly cheating with each other by helping each other out, that's their community strengths coming out.
Right.
And that's them, leveraging and using their voice and finding their strength and coming out of trauma by leaning on each other and caring for each other. Right. And so I think it's caused a lot of paradigm shifting to be like, how can we see with different eyes things that we might find disruptive because of our own cultures, and seeing that as shows of community strength, and community practice that means that people are healing and that they're doing really well at that, and they're doing it the best ways that they can.
Yeah, it seems like them helping each other out, even in the forms of cheating and whatnot, or other behaviors that we might attribute to be negative, right, has been, I mean, if you think of the journey of a refugee, the cause for why they're a refugee, that's probably not just a coping mechanism, but a survival mechanism
sure,
as to why they're even, able to be in our world at all.
Yeah.
So what are the greatest challenges to ministry in what you're trying to accomplish?
It's so interesting because when I think about challenges, immediately in my mind, I think, oh, all of these things that maybe are perceived as challenges are also things that I think come with great lessons to them or are great benefits. Like, I think my initial reaction was to be like, my greatest challenge personally is working remotely with so many people, or not having a team I can go to work each day with in an office and, have water cooler talk and have each other as sounding boards and working together really collaboratively. But I think that also ends up being such a blessing and a gift that I have to kind of be pushed beyond my comfort zones and reach out to and learn from and work together with a lot of people from all over the world. But I think probably my greatest challenge is that as much as I study and learn and, I've taken classes and gone through programs and gotten certifications and stuff, is that there's so much more to learn about both of these different topics, both trauma and cross-cultural things. And it feels really overwhelming then to be asked to, teach other people or provide resources for people, because there's so much that I feel like I don't know. And I guess the comforting thing is that when I talk to and have learned from the people who are the experts in these fields, or who have had decades and decades of experience in these fields, they also admit to a lot of not knowing, that there's so much to both like trauma and recovery and also cross-cultural interaction that we can't know because they're so complicated, and that God only knows. So but those are my biggest challenges, is feeling like I don't know enough, but also knowing that that's kind of where you have to hold it loosely and be like, I'm not gonna. So.
Yeah, I think for many people in our shoes, just trying new projects, diaspora work, etc., there is an education curve that goes with that. And I think we share that fear of, I don't know enough, I'm not ready. We I was talking with a young woman who is starting kind of in year one in a very random, out of the way place, and she was coming up with a lot of challenges that she was facing, and it was this whole, I'm looking for someone to lead, and I told her, look, my year one was spent looking for someone to learn from, and to follow, and to just kind of apprentice under. And because I happened to be the person asking and searching for that person, whenever people found someone who were like me, they sent them to me as the leader. But I wasn't. I mean, I didn't know anything. I was just trying to find someone. And so I think, part of kind of the collaborative journey for us as North American practitioners in meeting and networking and finding each other is this ability maybe to do more knowledge sharing and interaction and just, sounding board ideas, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think it would be helpful to pivot too to thinking about it as, like, I struggled, and I don't know if this is me being Chinese American, but I struggled with having titles like diaspora specialist or something specialist, because that sounds so authoritative to me, like a lot about something. But it was really helpful for me to have it reframed to being, you're specializing in looking at this, right? Like almost like you're focusing on this as a learner. And that helped me to feel like, okay, I can accept it if I'm a learner of this, not a, like some sort of, I'm the one who knows the most about this, like, because we need to have such a posture of humility in that we don't know what we're doing, and on another scale, I've been challenged to be like, how, who do you think you are that you know so much about this that you're going to go teach people or do things? It's like, I think it was really helpful for me to, hear from the Lord on this and be reminded of the boy who gave his loaves and fish, that he didn't do the miracles, that Jesus did the miracle. He was the one who multiplied all of the bread, all the fish, but the boy was just willing to come and bring his gifts, right? That he was like, I don't have anything special, like this is my lunch. And I think that's kind of the feeling that I have towards all of this, is like, I don't have the answers and I'm not the best person for any job or to do anything, but I'm not presenting myself as the miracle worker. Jesus is the one who's doing the miracles.
That's actually a very biblical posture. You and I have talked about, the role of North Americans in global missions and how does race relate to this, and we're going to have more conversations on this at a later date. But on one of my trips to Costa Rica, I do a lot of training for some Latino missionaries there, very young folks in training. And I was talking to one of these young men, and he was kind of just confessing to me, Brian, I just don't feel like I'm enough. And so there's an element of this where he sees other people from other countries being more successful, having better training, better funding, better teaming, etc.
Yeah.
And so he's feeling less than. And so my first response was, no, you are enough. And as the words are coming out of my mouth, I'm realizing this is garbage advice. And I had to stop myself and say, actually, your attitude is more biblical than mine. I said, because my American kind of cowboy, we got this. Let's ride in and do our job. I said, that's actually not a biblical attitude. That's a problematic attitude. Your attitude of we're not enough is actually 100% correct. And that's the point. We're not enough.
Right. Exactly.
Jesus is enough.
We're the broken pots, you know, like we're just willing to be there, and so we hope that in our brokenness that he's the one that leaks out, right? Like he's the one that does the work that he's meant to do through us so that his glory can be shown. So yeah, I don't know. I find that really helpful, because I think for those of us who aren't from more of an American, like, you can do it, you're the be all you can be, like that kind of attitude can be very demotivating, because you're like, I'm not all that, like, and I don't want to purport to be that,
So there's a lot of different ways of doing various elements of ministry. I know we talked with Trevor last week about translation, and that's kind of been one of the tip of the spear on, questions over contextualization and whatnot. But there's so many disagreements on how to do ministry to Muslims. How do you navigate these disagreements?
Pray a lot. I I don't know. Like, I think people have a lot of strong opinions, and they come from a lot of different perspectives on as to how to do this, right? Like, and how to do it right and how to do it well. I think for my role, because I'm trying to come alongside and partner with and support whoever is, doing the different ministry, like say in our context in San Diego, we have all these different friends and partners and churches and church people who are doing the work, or who are the ones who are mainly interacting with our Muslim friends and neighbors. And so with that, I feel like my role is to be supportive to them, and so it's sort of like I definitely might have my biases as to Muslim ministry and what I think, would be good, but mostly I feel like that's not really my place to influence them on that. It's more to be able to say, okay, when in whatever you're doing, how can you be the most trauma informed? How can you be loving people in ways that they feel and understand that, are not in the way, like that you don't get in the way of what God is doing with them, right? Like that you are trying to show love in ways that they understand, and you want to infuse in whatever approaches you're doing a trauma informed response so that it can do the least harm, and that in all of your good intentions, you're not kind of sabotaging that by hurting people as you do that. And so I don't know. I've kind of taken a neutral stance on that, like because I see myself as a support to people, and then also as someone who's wanting to be part of like the listening community, like to be providing for fellow ministry workers a safe place to share their burden and to care for them and pray for them.
I would imagine that disagreement over different ways to do ministry, whether it's strategic or contextualization or whatever, has actually probably produced a lot of trauma for many people, and so there might be some job security in being on the sidelines, as it were.
Yes.
So you mentioned being on the anthropology team, and part of that job being to kind of incorporate people from other backgrounds. This probably makes it even more challenging for you in terms of navigating identity. I think this is a common theme for diaspora workers, but maybe even more so for you because that's a more intentional focus. And so if you were on a monoethnic team, at least on the team perspective, you might be able to have a much simpler identity, at least in that circle. But how do you navigate your identity between, church, organization, Muslim friends, etc.? How do you come out on this?
I very gingerly and with massive oversimplification. I think with any person that I'm relating with, I kind of pick the simplest starter or like the commonalities that I can relate to or share with people who I am, and then go from there depending on the depth of our relationship. So, say with my Muslim friends, then, which tend to be women, or I guess men when I was teaching ESL and stuff, but it would be to present myself as like a wife and a mother, and to vaguely say that I do work, or in teaching or something like that, and then with church or with organization, it just depends on who I'm talking to. And I don't know, I think most people kind of do this anyway, is that, anyone who has any job, unless it's something that a lot of people know about, if they have more technical roles, nobody really knows or understands what you're talking about unless you're in that realm anyway, So it's like, how many of your friends in various professions do you really understand their job title and what they do from day to day? I mean, so in that, I think for whoever we're interacting with, you present whatever is the most relevant part of your role and understand that a bunch of that is not going to be known or understood. But if they're interested, then I'm willing to share more and to get into the different facets. But I think that's it. Massive oversimplification and just trying to find where there's overlapping interest or what could be useful for them to know so that we can relate well.
That's interesting you say that. I think for a lot of people, there's this real pressure to share and maybe this is just a more American trait, but there's this pressure to share everything that is true about themselves.
Authenticity.
And I think there's you have a little bit more nuanced take of, well, I'll share here and then see where that goes. I think that's a great approach.
I mean, it's just pragmatic.
Yeah. So how do you're a wife, a mother, you mentioned having a bunch of pets. Sounds like you're on a bit of information gathering quest within your organization on two different teams or spheres of influence, or I don't know what the right way to say that is, but how do you manage work-life balance?
I don't expect balance. I think that balance is overrated. I don't know. I remember in college that being a big push was like, how do you balance everything in life? And, I don't know that that's realistic. And so I think lowering expectations is really good. And like bringing before God all of these like hopes and aspirations and things and asking him to sift through that for what's really important and going after that. I think as I think about this, it makes me think of that moment, when Martha comes to Jesus and Jesus is like, you're really worried about a lot of things, Martha, but only one thing is needed, and I think for me, I'm always thinking about that, is what is the one thing that's needed, like what today is really important and what in general is important in my life, right? Like my family is important, my friendships, it's in doing things well, like relationship wise and trying to let God show me even through interruptions or through changes of plans or things not going the way that I intend, to be like, okay, this is what we need to focus on, because if not, there's just too much noise, right? Like there's too many competing things that you want or that you wish for in life. And I get really caught up with that. Like I find it really hard to kind of sort through all that mess because there's a lot of it for me. But to be like, okay, what are the priorities?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And how to do that the best.
So you mentioned having lower expectations. Do you mean of yourself or of what you're expecting to get out of life or to get done maybe?
Oh, both. Yeah. I lower expectations for myself that I'm not Superwoman, and I'm not going to do all these things to the level that I want them to be, like I know for myself a tendency towards perfectionism. It's really hard for me. And that I have so many interests, right? Like I was talking to a friend on Friday and we were laughing about how we would describe ourselves as insatiably curious. We're just lifelong learners, like to an extreme. And we have so many interests and so many things that we want to do or discover and learn about. And so for me, having to set that aside and be like, you can't have all of that and you can't do all of that. So what can you do? And, what things can you put aside to? And sometimes that also means disappointing myself or even other people, but I think I recognize that sometimes I have higher expectations for myself than other people or even
right.
God really does, and so needing to stop sometimes and just be like, okay, what does God want?
I think the Myers-Briggs needs maybe one more category, which is perfectionism versus imperfectionism. And then a good question would have been, how do you deal with disappointment?
Yeah, totally.
So tell us a story.
In the work that I've done, especially in training about trauma and or leading people through healing groups and practices and things like that, that there's been a lot of times when I've had people say like that they've had those aha moments about how, like they come to these things hoping to be able to be better trauma informed for other people, right? Like they're like, oh, I want to be, trauma informed for someone else. But for example, I did a training really briefly with a group of people who were doing a short term in the Muslim world, and they were learning these basics about trauma, and they were, preparing to go to work with alongside people in refugee camps. And someone said to me, oh my goodness, like what you're saying, that makes so much sense for me in a car accident I was in, and I didn't realize that the things that I've been struggling with have been because of that trauma, or different people saying, oh, what you're describing is what my daughter must be going through, like things that I didn't realize, and the way that she's been responding to us must be traumatic responses, or like just so much recognition for people in their own lives and how much they themselves have gone through trauma and how they need healing. And so it's so much where it's not the other, or it's not necessarily that, these people who have been through these really objectively difficult circumstances are so far different and far removed from us, and how we are such fragile people to a certain extent, where we've been built to be sensitive. We've been built really tough, right? Like God has definitely gifted us with such like strong wills to live and resilience that is amazing, and coping mechanisms and ways to heal. Like if you think about cutting your arm, God made it so that we can heal, but then also we have such a ability to get infections, like if things get dirty and we don't handle that well. And so
Right.
in all of that, it's really important for us, as believers to seek out and learn how to have God's healing, right? Like to learn how to clean up these wounds and to have him heal things. So yeah, I don't know. That's not really very specific, but
no, I yeah, and I understand the nature of your work being a little bit more personal with the people that you're probably the people that you're helping. So maybe this next question will help tease some of that out. What do you think other practitioners should know that you've discovered?
Yeah, so I think something that's been really amazing to me is thinking about how this ministry, like the ministry of trauma care, is so much of the gospel, and how in that there's so much healing that can occur even by proxy in a certain way. Because one of the tenets to healing, right, is that so much trauma, I mean, there's certainly like natural disaster trauma that's like not done by any person to another person, but so much of trauma is inflicted person to person, and it can be so healing to have a different person, listen to you and hear you, and to feel connected to a person when you've been so cut off from other people, right? Like when a trauma that's occurred from one person to another can then be healed. And I'll give the example of even like racial trauma, and some of the things that we've talked about in terms of you being a white man, and what position that puts you in. And I've heard from different white friends this kind of helplessness in saying like, well, it just seems like my presence can be so hurtful to other people because people immediately are triggered by me, and that like kind of I'm the wrong person to be in these different spaces. And I beg to differ, because I think that when you can become a safe person, that then you can by proxy be a very healing influence in such an overwhelming way, like, and not in like a white savior sort of way, but like that you can, if you can be like a white man who doesn't do the things, or doesn't have, in your lack of awareness of privilege or whatever, that you're able to interact with people of color in ways that are different from what they're so accustomed to being hurt by, you can be by proxy a healing influence in a way that is so very powerful, and that only you can do, that you can say, like, it's not, like, to, if people have only ever seen white males as these different painful things, and then you're able to not be that you have such a powerful position that, and part that you can play in that. And so I think in that you can be, someone who brings part of that kingdom of heaven on earth, right? Like that you can live that out.
Mm-hmm. So while we're on the topic of trauma and race, you've kind of hit upon an interesting crossroads, and I maybe just practically speaking, I know we've all have a TV and have seen what's gone on this last year, and for many of us in our churches, this has been something that we've struggled through and prayed through and tried to help through. But even apart from the racial issues, there have been an election year when wearing masks and not wearing masks has somehow become a left-right, blue-red state issue. How, and then all of that being mediated on social media, people have been fighting, I wouldn't say like never before, because sin is obviously the great unifier. Right. But there does seem to be just a trivial nature to how quickly people will fight, how fast people will break up with each other. I imagine a lot of people here have either unfollowed or unfriended, or been unfollowed or unfriended
sure, at
some point or another. So what would be maybe some essential steps that you would, I realize I just opened 5 different cans of worms, but in your mind, if you could kind of paint those all together, what would be some essential steps of people who are kind of waking up post-COVID and going, man, I fired off at that person and I didn't really have the whole story. Now what do I do? Or I said that thing that I thought, wasn't racially charged, but I just figured out that was in fact very racially charged. Or, how do you help people? What should their next steps be if they've had some major blowout during this time?
Yeah. I mean, you're kind of talking about like how people can work towards reconciliation, I think. And I think one thing is to take a stance of being very curious, and also thinking the best, right? Is, I think, and I felt this too. It's sort of like, oh, I thought this person was so wonderful, but now I think this. And catching yourself in that, to being like, no, go back to that expectation. That person that you knew, that person that you do know, they are a combination of a bunch of things, right? But that they've had different life experiences that you've had that have caused them to come to certain conclusions that you might not have come to. And so it's helpful for us to say, why is it that they would say these things that then I feel like means that they're X, Y, and Z, And can I try to look from their perspective, assuming the best of them, that they do whatever it is that about them, like, I don't know. I think about how so many people are like, I thought this person loved Jesus, but then I found out they voted for this person, it's like, well, there's a lot that goes into that, or like, how dare they not, think about this. But it's helpful for me, right, to think, what kind of information might they be taking in, or who might they be listening to, or why did they come to the conclusions that they've come to, if they are these really warm, loving, thoughtful, smart people that we know that they are. There must be reasons why. There must be certain data that they're taking in and things. There might also be holes in their information, or certain voices that they aren't hearing that mean that they're not able to make the same conclusions you are. But I would, if possible, I always think the more personal approach is best. Like, is going to those people and being like, hey, can we have a conversation? And I've really enjoyed that different friends of mine, even acquaintances that I haven't talked to in decades, would reach out to me personally and be like, hey, I see that I respect you, but I see that you've come to conclusions or have talked about things in ways that I'm curious about, and can we learn from each other, and been able to have good conversations or even disagree on things and be able to share where our viewpoints are on those things. And I think that we can learn so much, about different perspectives and different places that people come from. And that, especially if, as believers, like we have the ability to have that forgiveness, right? To forgive and to forgive in ways that are beyond ourselves. Because I think it's not human to forgive, really.
Right.
I think that, especially in some deeper cases, that's almost an impossibility, right? But if we think about how much we've been forgiven, and how with the worst, like all the sins in the world that God was able to forgive, through Jesus, that is like our superpower, is being able to then extend that forgiveness and work towards that. Like, I don't know, forgiveness itself is its own huge, gigantic topic, but to be able to recognize another person as another fallible human being, who can be forgiven, and that we can offer that as a way to free them and free ourselves as well. Like, I know a lot of people are like, think of it as freedom for yourself, and I'm like, yeah, I mean, I guess it is a freedom to yourself, but I don't know that necessarily has to be our main perspective, is some personal thing, like do it for you,
Right. Right.
Because I think it's just incredibly hard, and we need help, and I think we need God to help us to do that, because it's something supernatural. And I think for people who have forgiven others, whether they know God or not, like they're doing something that's very beyond themselves, So I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, sure. So if God would answer one prayer with a yes, what would you ask?
wow, this is such a big blank check, and like kind of my deepest wish, right? Like, I think probably right now, one of my biggest heart's desires and things that I wish that God would say yes to, like, and I think it's his desire as well, but I'm curious how he would answer this, is for there to be able to be the global church working together,
Mm-hmm.
and people from lots of different backgrounds to be able to recognize in each other strengths, and utilize those on behalf of the kingdom, right? And in that we would be able to live out on earth, God's vision for unity and working together, for showing, like when it says in scripture about how they'll know we are Christians by our love, or they'll know him because of the love that we have for each other. I think in that is so much dignity and honor that's given to one another, and recognizing, that what we do is so often out of a cultural perspective and bend that we've all been raised, in our own respective cultures to believe is the right way to do things. And to then say, hey, as we work together to reach people in different cultural places, who else in the global church might we want to empower or work alongside or learn from, that can best help us to reach to that place, to that people that could be the ones who could culturally help us navigate this in the best possible way. And so it would be that I'd love to see the strength of the nations utilized, and that people would know when to step back as well as when to step forward, right? Like to say, here's my gifts, but I also recognize these people have gifts more suitable to this situation, or can lend this to this, and I want to give them the space to do that.
That's good. Well, Samantha, thank you so much for coming on the show.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure to talk.
Again, everyone, I want to invite you to listen to Samantha on a follow-up episode on Nations Reaching Nations. You can just search that in any podcasting app and it will pop up, as we're going to be talking about how to make teams and organizations and projects more multicultural, and how to make these places more friendly for greater interaction and collaboration across ethnic lines. Also, I want to remind you that in the coming year, we are switching formats a little bit. We've been doing individual interviews with practitioners and have essentially asked the same kinds of questions to every single person, just to sort of put a baseline down. And Nate and I are going to be processing these very soon, and maybe have some back and forth conversation for you to listen to about what are some of the themes and commonalities and interesting things that we've learned from this year interviewing all of you. But in the coming year, we're going to switch to a multi-guest panel discussion on particular topics. And so we're going to pick just a lot of hot-button issues, very interesting cutting-edge issues that have come up through conversations that we've been having in 2020. Obviously, we've been doing a lot of Zoom meetings with people. I hope that some of you listening to this have been able to get in on some of those. If not, just reach out to us with an email, and we'll be happy to reach out to you and talk with you soon. But yeah, these conversations have just brought up so many interesting topics that we hope to get into in a group fashion in 2021. And so with that, I will simply say Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and we hope to see you again next year.
You've been listening to the Medina Podcast. This show is hosted by Brian Hebert and produced by Nate Schultz. The conversations we have on this program are born out of an expanding environment of collaboration among grassroots ministry practitioners across the North American continent. If you would like to engage on a deeper level, please email us at medinafocus@vision59.com.